So last week we examined images of the empire in Revelation, or more broadly, images of what Walter Wink calls the domination system underlying all the empires of the world. We looked at the dragon in Revelation, and we didn't have to guess at the dragon's symbolism because Revelation tells us exactly what it symbolizes. It symbolizes Satan in the book. Then the dragon in the book called forth a great beast from the sea, and based on similar images from the book of Daniel, we deduced that the beast must symbolize the empires of the world, and even describes the way that empires build on themselves over the course of history, becoming more and more efficient in their violence and their seduction and their concentration of power. Then we met a second beast described as some kind of propaganda and economic machine of the empire. This beast had the ability to make everyone dependent on the empire for buying and selling and making a living. In other words, dependent on the empire for our very lives. Today we meet another animal in Revelation. This one clearly symbolizes Christ. At this point in Revelation, John is having a vision of the throne room of heaven with God seated on a fantastic throne. This vision began in chapter 4, and it included a great crystal sea before the throne of God with 24 elders with crowns surrounding the crystal sea. And from time to time, they fall on their knees and they take their crowns and they throw them on the sea, from which we get the line in the hymn that we're going to sing after the sermon, "Holy, holy, holy, all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns upon the glassy sea." In chapter 5, which we just read, we're told that God is sitting upon the throne and holding a scroll with 7 seals. And it's got writing on the inside and on the outside, but, quote, "no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or look inside it because no one was deemed worthy." And so John weeps. John, the visionary, the author of the book, weeps. Perhaps because he's so close to having some great mystery unveiled. He's had this vision, he's gotten to the throne room of God, there's a scroll and he can see writing on it, and it's not going to be opened. But then one of the elders in heaven says, "Wait, there is one who's worthy." And at first this worthy one is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, which is clearly another reference to Jesus Christ, and an unsurprising reference based on what we know of Revelation so far, because the lion at that time was a symbol of royalty, a symbol of power, and we've already heard Jesus referred to in chapter 1 of Revelation as the ruler of the kings of the earth, the first and the last and the living one, the one who holds the keys of death and Hades. So when Jesus is announced as a lion, John might be thinking, yes, here comes powerful Jesus. Here comes royal Jesus, lion Jesus, to open up this scroll. But then we get the big twist. John turns to look for this mighty lion, and what he sees is a little lamb. And not just a little lamb, but a slaughtered lamb that was standing up alive. This lamb is said to have 7 eyes, which we are told symbolize 7 spirits of God sent out into the world. We're going to come back to that at the end of the sermon. The symbol of Jesus, though, as a slaughtered lamb, will continue to be the most consistent symbol throughout the book of Revelation. For all of the bizarre things that we find in Revelation of beasts and dragons and pits of fire and all kinds of things, this image of a little lamb that's been slaughtered is one of the most consistent, and it's the image of Jesus. So let's dig into it a little bit more. Since it's a slaughtered lamb, and that word slaughtered in particular, let's talk about the relationship between humans, animals, and violence. There are multiple times in history when human beings have justified horrible violence against each other by referring to whole groups of people as animals. Africans were called animals, and that justified their enslavement and abuse. Jews in Germany were called less than human, and that justified their slaughter. Indigenous people in this country were called savages and barbarians, and that justified their genocide. Most recently, Israel's references to the war in Gaza include phrases like, we're fighting human animals, and we're going to make Gaza a slaughterhouse. Those are two quotes documented in South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice, according to the AP News. So really, anytime one group needs to justify violence against another group, they say that those people are just animals, or no better than animals, or less than human. In Baltimore, I had the privilege of making some connections with the Black vegan community in that city. Oftentimes people think that vegans are just white, hippie, earthy, crunchy people. But it turns out there's a vegan movement within the Black community. There are groups like Afro-Vegan Society, Black Vegan Society, New Roots Institute, Hip Hop is Green, and Vegan Voices of Color. And within this movement, there are people with lots of diverse motivations, just as all vegans have diverse motivations. One big one in the movement is health, though. Part of the movement is encouraging Black people to eat healthier food, even as they maintain the innovation and creativity of the soul food diet or traditional diet. But in addition to health, they make a fascinating connection, or some do within this movement, which is a social justice connection. It is the connection between the violence and abuse that we inflict on animals and the violence and abuse that white people inflict on people of color in a white supremacist society. The basis of this connection is that if we can justify mistreating people because they are, quote, no better than animals, then maybe the problem is not how we treat people, but how we treat animals. Maybe we should not be critiquing who deserves violence and instead critique the violence itself. And just to name what we're talking about here when we talk about the mistreatment of animals in our food system, we're talking about things like extreme confinement throughout a lifetime, mutilation, separation of mothers from their babies. You can't have cow's milk unless you separate the calf from its mother. Killing of unwanted babies like male chicks in the egg industry. Slaughter of animals at a fraction of their lifespan. Genetic engineering that leads to a life of suffering. Emotional distress of factory slaughter. And just the scale of the killing in the food industry. Author and philosopher Sly Ko, in her book of essays with her sister Afko, the book is called Afroisms, talks about how Black people and other people of color are often pushed by white people to the borderlands of the human-animal divide. I'm going to read a somewhat extended quote from her. She writes, "When we excuse a harm committed against a being, saying it's just an animal, we need to interrogate the just in use there. The human-animal divide, or binary, where the human and the animals form oppositional poles, is not an objective model handed to us from the heavens. The human and the animal were placed through the positing of a racial system. Racial frameworks and human-animal frameworks are deeply intertwined and cannot be made sense of independent of one another. They were both creations invented by a small percentage of people who took themselves to be the singular point of knowledge and through centuries of violence, genocide, and control made their view of the world, themselves, and the other universal." She continues, "It's clear to me that we truly want to take white supremacy, racism, and coloniality to task, then we need to do the same for the view that the animal is the opposite status marker of the human. As long as these notions of the animal and the human are intact, white supremacy remains intact." Now that might seem like a leap to some, but think for a moment of how indigenous people of the world, before they were colonized and even still today, how they see animals. Indigenous people of the world did not and do not see the beings of the world according to this animal-human binary. They see animals as sentient beings and sometimes divine. And they see themselves as part of this interconnected web of life with all the animals. They still hunt and they still kill animals, but they do so with a greater reverence, respect, and sorrow for the killing. Further, the animals are always wild and free before it is killed and not confined. And the killing and the preparation of the animal is a much more intimate and communal and tribal work. So based on this view of animals, indigenous people often have hunting practices like taking only what's needed, using every part of the animal, asking the animal's permission before killing it, sensing if the animal is offering itself or not, and not taking the shot if they don't get that sense, thanking the animal for its life, leaving an offering in the wilderness for what was taken, preparing for the hunt by ceremonially dressing like the animal the night before. All of these are expressions of this sense of connection between the human and the animal and the moral gravity of taking any life. Now, let's think about the sedentary cultures of Jesus' time and John's time. And let's look at the temple in Jerusalem, or any animal temple where animal sacrifice is practiced. In some ways, the reverence of taking a life is still preserved in these temple practices through things like laying a hand on the animal before it's slaughtered, saying prayers, offering the animal to God, connecting the life of the animal to a person's life with a sacrifice leading to forgiveness, for instance, having the act done by a priest, and carefully prescribed treatment of the blood of the animal. But what changes in the temple from the indigenous people is not the loss of reverence so much in the killing, but the act of violence being turned over to an institution or a professional class. The act of violence is no longer personal or tribal, it's now institutional. It becomes part of the domination system, it becomes part of the empire. In response to this kind of institutionalization of violence, people began critiquing it, even in Old Testament prophets. There's a number of Old Testament prophets that critique the temple system. One is Isaiah chapter 11. "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I've had enough of your burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or lambs or goats. Instead, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow." Notice it goes from this institutionalized violence to a concern for those on the margins. In fact, Jesus may have been responding to this whole system of prophetic thought when he turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple and set the animals free. Now, modern slaughterhouses could also be considered modern temples in which there is almost no reverence for the life of the animal, and the violence is even more institutionalized and more efficient. The god worshipped in these temples is money, and any treatment of the animal or any amount of killing is justified in the spirit of profit. Okay, so let's bring all of that to our reading of Revelation and this vision of Jesus as a slaughtered lamb. This primary symbol of Jesus compares the violence he experienced on the cross at the hands of the state to the institutionalized violence animals experience at slaughter. If Revelation is an unveiling of what's really going on in the world, then the symbol of Christ as a slaughtered lamb tells us that one place that we can always find Christ in the world is wherever we find victims of institutionalized violence, including animals in slaughterhouses. And in a white supremacist society, we find victims of state violence most often among people of color, where the human-animal binary is used to justify that violence. So in this complicated situation, our task is not simply to more carefully define who is human and worthy of protection against institutionalized violence and who is animal and not worthy of that protection, but to understand that institutionalization of violence is always problematic, regardless of the species of the victim. Or to say it another way, institutionalized violence is always the work of the empire. It's always the work of the dragon. In Judaism, there is a practice called putting a fence around the Torah. It refers to the practice of putting additional restrictions on our behavior that go beyond the letter of the law, that go beyond what's written in the Bible. Those additional restrictions then protect us from accidentally transgressing the law because of our carelessness and our ignorance. So we don't know exactly where the line is, so we're going to put a fence around the line so we don't even get close to it. So if there's a line that says you shall not kill, and we think that killing animals is okay, yet we see how we have regularly failed to define who is a person and who is an animal correctly, then maybe we need to put a fence around that line so we don't get so close to it. We could say that we're not going to kill animals at all in an institutionalized setting anymore, just in case accidentally we include humans in that process, as we have shown we are prone to do. Or we could be very careful and say, well, we're not going to kill animals at all. And if we put that fence around killing, we not only protect ourselves from transgressing the commandment, thou shalt not kill, but we eliminate the borderland between human and animals that has been so easily abused throughout history. So, am I saying we should all be vegan? Not necessarily. Only because I've learned as I've gotten older to avoid black and white thinking as much as possible. There's no way to eat perfectly ethically in an imperial capitalist system. There's no way to avoid all violence in what we eat. But I think we are called to respond to this commodification and cruelty inflicted on animals in our modern system, especially as Christ is imagined as a slaughtered animal in our scriptures. And that may mean eating less meat, once a week instead of every day, or once a month instead of once a week. It may mean giving up dairy, remembering again that every milk is only produced when you separate a mother from her calf. It may mean trying to buy meat or animals that are humanely raised or from a local farm, making it more community and intimately oriented, advocating for laws on how animals should be treated. There's lots of ways we can respond, but the question is the same as the one we ended up with last time. How do we live in the empire, and can we separate ourselves from the worst parts of the empire? Now, I said we would come back to the image of the Lamb having 7 eyes that are the 7 spirits of God in the world, and I'll end on that topic. I'm going to read a quote by a woman named Tanya Tagaq. She's an Inuit throat singer, songwriter, novelist, and generally creative person. And she says this from her indigenous perspective, keeping in mind that hers is a hunting culture. The animals are always watching. They know who is respectful, who is wasteful, who says thank you. They are people too. The 7 eyes on the slaughtered lamb probably symbolize that Christ is watching us. And maybe the fact that they are on a lamb suggests that Christ is watching us through the way we treat animals. The image of the slaughtered lamb demands some kind of response from us. John's vision of the spiritual reality behind the veil of the physical reality is this vision of Christ as a victim of institutionalized violence, and the image he chooses or the image he sees is not a human, it's not a slave, it's not a child, it's not even a person of color. It's an animal, a young animal. Empires are built on hierarchies and on domination. Who can be mistreated? Who can be tortured? Who can be killed? And who can't? In such an imperial hierarchy, the question Christians should ask is not who are legitimate victims of our violence, but how can we move toward nonviolence in every part of our lives? Amen.